Hello and welcome to Kurtzburn Publishing. My name is Vincent Gillen and today I'll be talking about an awful lot of people called Duncan. The Darrochs, Lairds of Gourock. The clan of Darroch appear in the records as tacksmen, farming lands at Tarbert, Jura, under the protection of the Campbell, Laird of Gourock. A tacksman was a person who holds a lease and sublets lands to others. Tacksmen were mostly found in the Highlands from the 17th century and were often a close relative of the chief. Although some of them farmed the land themselves, most lived off the differences between the low rent they paid to the chief and the rents they charged to sublet the land. According to sources, the Sept had apparently been one of the many families belonging to the MacDonalds of the North and South, who at one time held considerable lands on Islay and Jura, but were to some extent under Campbell overlordship. The Darroch of that time stood cautioner for a considerable sum for Campbell of Jura shortly before the 1745 campaign. When Prince Charles Edward's adventure failed, Jura refused to pay back any of the money which Darroch had guaranteed, and threatened, should Darroch make any fuss, to hand over to the authorities various Darroch kinsmen who had served in the Jacobite army. Darroch was thus ruined. Our Duncan Darroch is Duncan I, as we will call him. It was said that at about the age of 18 he emigrated to Jamaica and entered into business with a Mr. Rowan, whose daughter, Mary, he eventually married and later gained control of the business. They had a large family, but all died in infancy, except one boy, Duncan, who was brought to Europe after his mother's death. It is likely that the Mary Rowan was a free-coloured woman, and one source claims that they weren't married. Now, there is very little evidence as to what Duncan did in Jamaica. I've only found two references. One was in 1781, where there's a reference to a Duncan Darroch being a subscriber in Hanover St James and Westmoreland in a land deal of sorts, and this is in the Royal Gazette of Jamaica. He's also a subscriber to guaranteeing coinage during a shortage in 1781. In 1782, there are two bills of exchange for Duncan Darroch on James France, a Liverpool merchant and plantation owner. James France was a Liverpool merchant who imported sugar, rum and other commodities from the West Indies, and known as a Jamaica merchant. From about 1730, the merchants of Liverpool made huge profits from the slave trade. The trade formed a triangle. Goods from Manchester were given to the Africans in return for slaves, and on the 1st of January 1783, France took into partnership his nephew Thomas Hayhurst, and the firm of France and Nephew was created in Jamaica for £200, and Maclean's Mackay and Company of Glasgow for £200. So again, this is all part of the triangular trade. There were some voyages from Greenock and Port Glasgow, but the majority seemed to have been from Liverpool, Bristol and London. But this was the environment in which Duncan Darroch had gone to Jamaica and was living in and had experienced and had made his fortunes from. There is a story, probably apocryphal, told of Duncan Darroch that when leaving the country on his way to Jamaica, he was detained in Greenock waiting for his ship to sail. He and another immigrant lad walking in the country came across a fine mansion with an apple orchard attached. The two lads improved the shining hour by climbing into the garden and helping themselves to the ripe fruit. They were, however, unceremoniously chased out by a gardener. As they left the premises, Duncan shook his fist at the gardener and shouted, "I am going off to Jamaica, but I will come back and buy this estate with its apple orchard." Duncan did go to Jamaica and, returning having made a fortune, purchased the estate as he said he would. The same gardener was still on the estate and continued in the employment of the new owner. When Duncan won and bought the Gourock estate in 1784, he was a successful West Indian merchant, and he paid $15,000 for it, almost $2 million. He purchased it from John Orr of Barrowfield, a relative of the Stuarts of Castlemilk who had owned the estate previously. He was, as his certificate of arms sets forth, chief of the sect or clan of Darroch. Buying the estate was the ultimate status symbol, signifying that one had made it. Among the rights purchased with the property and superiority of Gourock was that of fishing for salmon on the Clyde. The present laird still holds this charter. General Darroch let the fishing and netting for £6 per annum. This view of Gourock shows Gourock House on the left, which Duncan had built. But rounding its eastern shoulder, we now enter the beautiful Bay of Gourock, which, like a huge half-moon, is spread in one bold yet graceful sweep before our gaze. The tide is at the full, and the lipping billows seem absolutely desirous of kissing the tempting fringe of grass. The water is all alive with boats, and women and children are lounging in eadless on the shore. The town, which is situated in the western haunch of the bay, has a most pleasing effect from the water. It is seen with its church and its castellated mansion, and its tower-crested hills swelling proudly beyond. The houses are mostly ranged along the shore, or straggling to slight elevations on the rising ground behind. In a finely wooded recess to the south, and surrounded by gardens and green lawns, is the mansion of General Darroch, the principal local proprietor and grandee par excellence of the neighbourhood. The structure, which is rather plain and unimposing, was erected about the middle of last century, near the site of the old castle of Gourock, which was then entirely demolished. From an article in 1857. Gourock was a small fishing village, with a harbour being built as a joint venture with Darroch and other investors. It is reported that Mr. Darroch had intended to return to his business in Jamaica, but instead in 1791 he married again, this time a Miss Janet McClarty, daughter of a Port Glasgow shipmaster. In one letter from a Colin McClarty to his sister Margaret in 1781, he comments that matrimony seems to be quite the fashion in Greenock at present. Indeed, whilst the men of the McClarty family write of their studies, work and travel, their sisters remain home, focused on getting good husbands. They had a numerous family, most of whom died in infancy, but two attained majority. Malcolm, who served in the 4th Regiment in Malta, but died at an early age, and Angus, who succeeded to the Gourock estate at his father's death in 1824. The old man was 82. He made several wills, in each of which he executed the strictest entail over the estate of Gourock, and bound his trustees to purchase more land in Renfrewshire with the capital funds left at his death. These amounted to £50,000. A son, Donald Darroch, was born in 1794 and died in 1809. Malcolm Darroch was born in 1798 but died in 1822, and Angus, who was born in 1800, went to Perth Academy in 1816, married to a Mary Cumming at Drum's House in Port Glasgow on the 28th of February 1827, but died on the 17th of June that year, 1827. The trustees of the estate bought two contiguous estates known collectively as the Drums, where the village of Linebank now stands, and containing the farms of Upper and Nether Gledoch and Bars Cube. By the entails, the succession went first to the sons of the second marriage, with succession to their children, sons being preferred to daughters. If none had any children, the succession was to open to Duncan, the only surviving child of his first marriage. Angus did succeed, but held the life rent only from 1824 to 27. He was seen as somewhat of a wild one, and as he had no children and died young, Duncan II, or Duncan III, became the heir to both properties. So he was the second Duncan, but the third Laird. Duncan I had also bought the Fancy Farm estate belonging to the Donald family. an established family of successful merchants, there is now actually a fancy farm in Virginia, still owned by the Donald family, and from purchase from the proceeds of the sale of Fancy Farm in Greenock. The original lands that the Donalds owned included what we see here, which is Ravenscraig Hospital. This is the sale notice of Fancy Farm and Fancy Farm in Virginia on the right. This is a map of the lands of the Gourock estate and the Fancy Farm estate. This map of Gourock clearly shows Gourock House and its gardens. Interestingly, also the site of Gourock Castle and a tomb. And this note about Gourock Castle: the seat of the barony of Finnart Stewart stood above the town of Gourock. It was pulled down about 1747. In 1856 the site was pointed out by Major Darroch, who stated that a few stones, visible near the edge of the Gourock burn, formed part of the original foundations. In the reign of James II it was forfeited by the Earl of Douglas and passed to the Stewarts of Castlemilk. No trace of the castle building remains, and the site is marked by a small flat-topped mound. Duncan I of Gourock died at Gourock House on the 18th of June 1823, aged 82 years and 9 months. Now seems as good a time as any to talk about the Darroch coat of arms. Its origins lie in the clan Darroch seals, which include a ship, oak trees and a representation of a black man or native holding a dagger. Darroch was successful, so buying a coat of arms was almost the equivalent of buying a Ferrari today. It was all about status. Duncan was showing to everyone that he had made it and that his name was one to be respected. So he incorporated these items in his crest and added elements that were specific to his story. The official description of the Darroch arms registered by Duncan I is arms argent, a 3-masted ship under full sail in a sea, all proper, between 3 oak trees eradicated and fruited of the last. Crest, a demi-negro holding in his dexter hand a dagger, proper. Supporters, 2 alligators, proper. Motto, be watchful. The alligator is the official animal of Jamaica. The purpose, therefore, of a coat of arms is to show status by emphasising lineage, success, and, as it says on the tin, the right to bear arms. The dagger represents this fact. The Gourock Borough Seal, a combination of the Stewarts of Castlemilk and Darroch, was designed by a James T. Tomlinson, who was a storeman at Scott's Engine Works and whose hobby was heraldry. This was done in the early 70s. In a local book about Gourock, the seal is described as follows. The West Indian connection is reflected in the Darroch crest, a demi-negro proper, stabbing himself in the breast with a dagger in his dexter hand. During a rising, rebel slaves had abducted the daughter of Duncan Darroch's manager. An expedition was organised, and when Duncan Darroch came up with the leader, the latter, seeing that resistance was useless, stabbed himself in the breast with a dagger. Utter nonsense. Yes, so I think we can leave this topic here. I don't want to get into trouble. Duncan, the third Laird of Gourock, after Angus, the second Laird, was, as we said, the son of the first marriage or relationship. General Duncan Darroch of Gourock was born on the 1st of December 1774. He entered the British Army at the age of 18 and during 23 years was on active service in Germany, South America, Spain, Portugal and North America, as well as on important duties in Great Britain and Ireland. He died at Gourock House on the 16th day of February 1847. It is noted that when his father had returned to Europe, Duncan was educated first at Harrogate's and later in Paris. He was in Paris at the time of the French Revolution, and he described in a letter home the last appearance of King Louis and his Queen Marie Antoinette in the streets of the capital. He also joined a body of English volunteers who planned to rescue the royal family. So to repeat his military connections, he joined the British Army, but his father bought the commission, and this was quite a common thing to do with illegitimate sons and the other sons, was to buy them a career. So his father apparently bought his commission, and the cost of which his father never seemed to grudge. They were on good terms, but he disliked his stepmother. Much of his early army career was spent in the southwest of Ireland, and there he married Elizabeth Cotter, daughter of the Reverend George Sackville Cotter and granddaughter of the first Baronet of Rock Savage. He then saw service in South America, Portugal, and eventually was in command in Halifax, Nova Scotia. He retired as a Major General in 1815 and with his wife lived in Surrey. On the death of Angus, he succeeded to the estates of Gourock and Drums, and he and his wife took up residence in Gourock House about 1830. Although under the terms of the entail he was considerably restricted as to the amount of ready cash which he could raise on the two properties, General Darroch's first action was to improve the policies of Gourock House and lay them out pretty well as they were when the borough took over. The bridge over the burn was erected in 1833. He was also responsible for the building of the square tower on the northeast end of the parish, now Old Gourock Church, and he built the tower on Tower Hill, which was completed in 1847. That was the year of his death, and for some years previous to this, his son Duncan, with his family, lived with him. This is an early view of Gourock, with the parish church on the left. Duncan III, despite possibly being an illegitimate son, born to, as we said, Mary Rowan, who was likely to have been a free coloured woman, succeeded to the estate. His 4 surviving children, born in Ireland, Canada and perhaps Scotland, were not baptised until 1824, when the eldest was 24. This image is of Alexander MacDonald of the Glengarry Fencibles, of which Duncan Darroch, the second or third Laird, was the Lieutenant General. Here are also the exact details of his commissions and his dates of service. On the 16th of February 1839, Margaret Janetta Louisa Darroch married George Rainey, aged 48. Margaret was 27 and the daughter of General Duncan Darroch and his Irish wife Elizabeth Cotter. Unfortunately, Margaret died only 22 months after her marriage in November 1840. Marriages were very much about the contacts. So George Rainey, 1790 to 1863, was in Demerara in 1808 and later became a partner in the Liverpool firm which from 1813 would be called Sandbach Tin. They traded with and had property in Demerara where they were known as McInroy, Sandbach & Co. You might recognise the name McInroy from McInroy's Point in Gourock. George acted on their behalf in Demerara between 1828 and 1832, and in 1832 was their attorney on plantations Edinburgh, Leonora and Tuchen de Vrienden. In his journal, J.C. Cheveley described a visit in 1821 to the tall, gaunt-looking store of Messrs. McInroy, Sandbach & Co., looked up to as the Rothschilds of Demerara, rich and influential. Many estates were heavily mortgaged to them, their whole business connected to the arrangements to which the mortgagors were strictly tied down. All the sugar must be shipped home in their ships under their agency, both here and at home, and so much every year. all plantation stores to be bought of them, and other pickings highly profitable to the mortgagee, who got full rates and commissions, considerably more so than planting was to unfortunate mortgagers, who got about as much as would just keep them on their legs. Other produce, such as coffee and cotton, was subject to like conditions. Here I found the executive of this formidable establishment, Mr. George Rainey, whom Mr. Pattinson had told me I would find very keen. Slow-spoken, he had a sharp visage, high thin nose, and a cold, quiet, calculating grey eye. He and his coadjutor, Mr. George Buchanan, brought enormous gains to the Liverpool House and to McInroy, Parker and Co. in Glasgow. Though they dealt fairly, their business was money lending. George Rainey returned to Britain, living in London, and was married 3 times. At emancipation, he was the primary claimant for over 50,000 compensation for almost 1,000 slaves, and a secondary claimant on a number of other properties. Here we talk about George Rainey and the Highland clearances. In 1845, George Rainey bought the island of Raasay, where he later evicted many of the tenants. One of his policies in Raasay was to forbid his tenants to marry, a measure of control reminiscent of the slave plantations. What became of the people? They went to other kingdoms, some to America, some to Australia, and other places that they could think of. Mr. Rainey enacted a rule that no one should marry on the island. There was one man there who married in spite of him, and because he did so, he put him out of his father's house, and that man went to a bothy, to a sheep-cot. Mr. Rainey then came and demolished the sheep-cot upon him and extinguished his fire, and neither friend nor anyone else dared give him a night's shelter. He was not allowed entrance into any house. And that's the evidence of a Donald MacLeod, crofter, aged 78, in evidence to the Napier Commission in 1883. So we can see the connections that the Darrochs had with the West Indies and the people involved in money there. You married your daughters to people of power and influence. This is a Robertson photograph of Gourock in quite an early date, and you can see a view from the Lyle Hill, or the Binions as it was known. You can see the tower and Tower Hill. And to quote from a talk given by William Robertson, the photographer, "We again resume our journey and climb to the Tower Hill. Many have asked the question, what's that for? Well, my informant, a Gourockian who was at the building of the tower, told one it was erected by the late General Darroch as a summer house. My friend has seen the General ride up on his pony and there enjoy scenery unsurpassed. It is a pity to see it gradually falling away. By a little outlay, the tower might easily be restored to something useful. It is surprising that it is allowed to go to neglect and ruin by our town commissioners." On the right of the picture is a newspaper article saying, "A prominent Clyde landmark, the Tower Hill, Gourock, is to become municipal property. Major Duncan Darroch, the Superior of Gourock, has agreed to sell the tower to the Town Council at a price of £1,000 on the understanding that it will be kept and used as an open space for the benefit of the inhabitants of Gourock. The small stone building at the top of the hill is included in the sale, and Major Darroch proposes to place a suitable tablet on it when it is derequisitioned after the war." Our next Duncan is Duncan IV of Gourock and of Drums. He was a major in the army, born in 1800, married in 1829 to the daughter of Charles Stewart Parker of Fairley, a West Indian merchant, along with Rainey and Sandbach and Tin, and Duncan IV died on the 13th of October 1864. Duncan IV had a military career like most of the Darrochs. This article reports among the 1,600 troops who assisted at the burial of Napoleon at St Helena, May 9, 1821, was Lieutenant Duncan Darroch of the 20th Foot. The day after the ceremony, he wrote his mother an account of it. Napoleon had died on May 5th, and his body remained in its island tomb until 1840, when by direction of King Louis Philippe, it was conveyed to Paris and placed in a magnificent sarcophagus under the dome of the Hôtel des Invalides. Lieutenant Darroch's letter has been published for the first time in the Sunday Times of London. Sir Hudson mentioned in the letter, which is reprinted here, was Sir Hudson Lowe, who had been Governor of St Helena since 1816, shortly after Napoleon was interned there. The letter read, "We yesterday interred the remains of Napoleon Bonaparte with military honours. The funeral I will describe as best I can. In the first place, you must understand the figure of the ground near Longwood. The island, generally speaking, is composed of high and narrow diverging ridges of hills running or rather diverging from Diana's Peak towards the coast, where they terminate abruptly in tremendous precipices. Valleys between these are very deep. Chosen by Napoleon, Longwood is situated on one of these ridges, and the place Nap chose for his body to lie in was in the valley between that and James Valley, where the town is, and which, from its circular form, is called, at least near the head of it, the Devil's Punch Bowl. The part near the sea is called Rupert's Valley. The troops, of which there were about 1,600, were formed from Longwood Guardhouse on the bank above the road in succession by seniority 20th Marines, 66th St Helens Artillery Regiment and Volunteers, on the left 11 guns of the Royal Artillery as a firing party. We were in open order, resting on our arms reversed. Bands played the dirge. After a little while the procession appeared through the gate. First came the priest and Henry Bertrand, carrying the censer. After these, Dr. Arnott and the French doctor. Next the undertakers, and then the body. The body of his own carriage had been taken off, and something like an open hearse put in its place. He was drawn by 4 of his own horses, with postilions in his imperial livery. There was a plain mahogany coffin, and instead of a pall, a cloak was thrown over it. On the top was a large book with his sword lying on it. Napoleon Bertrand and the head valet walked one on each side of the hearse. 6 of our grenadiers, without arms, marched on each side. French wear black. After the body came the lead horse, beautifully caparisoned. On either side rode Counts Bertrand and Montholon. After them, a small carriage with the Countess and 2 of her children in it. All the French were in black. The naval and staff military officers followed, and as soon as the whole had passed the left of the rear, we rounded arms and followed. The troops did not go down into the valley, but formed in the road immediately over the grave, in the same order resting on our arms, while the ceremony went on. I must now describe the grave or tomb that was prepared for him. The spot that he chose is in the highest extremity of a small garden belonging to a Mr. Torbet. It is completely overhung for a space of about 30 square yards or more with live or 6 weeping willows, and a little on one side was a spring of the best water on the island, and which he used every day to send for. This runs down the valley. There is no stream perceptible. Near the grave the moisture is just sufficient to keep the turf completely green and the place cool. Here the grave was dug. Interior capacity was 12 feet deep, 8 feet long and 6 feet wide, surrounded by a wall about 3 feet thick all the way down, and plastered with Roman cement to about 2 feet from the bottom, and resting on blocks of stem. The stone coffin was constructed like a large stone box with the lid open and the lid resting on one of its edges. Another piece about Captain Duncan Darroch of Drums near Dumbarton. A friend of Georgiana Malloy near Kennedy, Australian botanist, when she was living in Scotland, was even more dashing and eligible than I had space to detail in the book. This future Baron of Gourock was part of the military guard for the exiled French Emperor Napoleon Bonaparte on the small barren island of St. Helena. He was present when Napoleon died, an event that caused even the most patriotic English soldiers to collect souvenirs, a lock of hair or a piece of lint dipped in Napoleon's blood. Another notice. Ensign Darroch arrived in St. Helena on February 29, 1820 in the Camel and stayed until after the funeral of Napoleon. After the death of the Emperor, he was on guard at Longwood, and in letters written by him, he states that he entered the death chamber when Burton was taking the plaster of Napoleon's face, but that he was unable to remain long in the room on account of the stench. And that's letters published by Major Smythe in the Annual of the Lancashire Fusiliers for 1904. Here's an image of Napoleon in exile on the left and a plaster cast of his death mask on the right. A scene from the deathbed of Napoleon in St. Helena. So the relationships between Jamaican or West Indian merchant families continued. Charles Stewart Parker of Fairlie and Margaret Rainey. So again, all these interrelationships. She died at Gourock House in 1844. Charles Stewart Parker was compensated for over 400 slaves he shared ownership of on 16 estates in British Guyana. A view of Gourock with a slightly exaggerated Tower Hill, I think, but showing the Newcastle on the right, and the church, and of course Darroch House on the left, or Gourock House on the left, I should say. And so we come to the next Duncan, Duncan the 5th Laird of Gourock, Renfrewshire, and of Torridon. He was born in 1836 and died in 1910. At the age of 14, Duncan experienced a traumatic event that stayed with him throughout his life. He was involved in the sinking of the SS Orion in 1850 off Port Patrick. This is his account of what happened. My dear S, I write to apologise to you for not delivering your long letter to C, but I trust you will excuse me, as I had no time to save anything but my life in the dreadful occurrence which I am about to relate. Mr. P and I set sail from Liverpool on the 17th at 3:30 in the afternoon, and there were about 200 passengers on board. We had a beautiful smooth passage, all the ladies remaining on deck till late. At 11:30, as we passed the Isle of Man, we both went to bed. About 1:30 in the morning, I was woke by hearing the other gentlemen getting up and talking, and from whom I heard that we had run aground. I woke Mr. P, and he dressed quickly and ran upstairs. I, in the meantime, dressed very quickly, thinking there was no danger, as the sea was so calm and the shore near, and had just got my trousers, boots and shirt on, when down came Mr. P, saying we had gone ashore off the Irish coast, which I thought rather curious, and that I had better come on deck. One of the deadlights in our cabin happened to be open, and just then, the vessel sinking lower, The water poured into the cabin in a torrent. We both rushed on deck, accompanied by several ladies in their night clothes, screaming piteously. When we got on deck, I saw that the stern was high above the water and the bow perfectly immersed. We were only about 300 yards from the shore when we struck. The land was quite visible and the light of Port Patrick. We both went to the stern, and Mr. P left me there and went amidships, and I clung to the binnacle. The screams of the poor ladies, the prayers of the men, such as "O Lord, help us, God save us," and the roaring of the steam were frightful. Presently the vessel heeled right over, till the deck was almost perpendicular. Then came the most frightful part of the scene. The poor women slid down under the lee bulwarks, and were swept out by the next wave. Their screams were heartrending. Just then the passengers launched the lifeboat, but it was swamped instantaneously, and all drowned except 2. The seamen were too much terrified to do anything, but some jumped overboard, and others ran up the shrouds. I, in the meantime, was clinging to the binnacle, a part just before the wheel where the compass was kept, and when she went on her beam ends, I immediately divested myself of trousers and boots and flung them overboard, knowing that I could not swim with them on. Having done that, I waited patiently for the result, crying to God for help, as also most of the passengers were. When I saw the steam coming up the companion, and heard it making a horrible noise, then I thought that all was lost, and that we should have a precious blow-up. So committing my life into the hands of God, I plunged overboard. There were about 6 other men who jumped in with me, and they struck out so hard that they got me under water for about a minute. However, I soon got up and swam boldly for my life. When I had swum about 40 yards, I came to a chest on which a man was supporting himself. I made for it and reached it, but the seaman was in such agony of terror that he knew not what he did, and in foolishly endeavouring to get to the top of the chest, he turned it round like a treadwheel. I could not shift my hands as quickly as he pulled it over, and so I was pushed right under the water for about 2 minutes. At that awful time I felt the water coming in my ears and nose, and thought on home and my parents, and I felt that I should never see them more, and was giving up. But just then I felt a new vigour in my limbs, and determined not to relinquish life without a struggle, I dived down till I got free of the man in chest, and swam to some things which were floating nearby, and got something like a desk under one arm, and a kind of wooden grating under the other. With these I kept up for a long time. But looking round, I saw the large chest with the man who had stopped pulling it over. I swam to it therefore, and told him not to pull it, as our safety depended upon it. He remained quiet, but by way of precaution I still kept the wooden grating under my arm. Soon another man joined us on the chest. He got on the end and told us both to strike out for the land, which we all did, and were getting on very well, when we saw, to our inexpressible joy, a large boat coming round the point of Port Patrick. We all set up a shout, "O boat, for the love of God, O save us, O we are drowning," and all that sort of thing. Presently the boat heard us and approached, and you cannot tell the feelings which arose in my breast. Then the man in the bow laid hold of me to pull me in, I being too weak to scramble. As soon as he had laid me on the forecastle, I fell right over into the body of the boat, but then I was so cold. I began to jump and cut away into the stern sheets, and I sat down shivering like half a dozen rats. The other 2 men were pulled in more dead than alive. They lay in the bottom of the boat quite exhausted. We went on and picked up a poor woman off a piece of wreck where she'd been floating. Then we went to the wreck which had gone down, I suppose, when I was under the chest. The water, then being low, was not up to her cross trees, and there were a great many clinging to her shrouds, etc. We took a woman and her baby, and about 8 men off the wreck, and then made for the land. I, all the time, was jumping to keep myself warm, having nothing on but my shirt. When we got into the harbour, I ran up the landing stairs. At the top there was an old woman with a shawl in her hand, which she cast about me, and took me to her master's house, whose name was Captain Hawes, Royal Navy. They gave me some warm brandy and water, and put me into a warm bed, when I soon fell asleep. While I am having a comfortable nap at Captain Hawes' house, I will tell you what befell Mr. P. After he left me, he went to the companion, and when the Orion heeled over, he cut up the shrouds, where he remained till the last boat. He was the last to quit the unfortunate vessel. Mr. P. went to the companion to deposit there some articles of value, which he had brought up from the cabin. But he had scarcely stooped when the vessel fell over on her starboard side. And then, says he, commenced a mingled din of shrieking, screaming, crying, and praying. Several unfortunate beings were hurled into the pitiless water, never to recover themselves. Fortunately for me, there was a rope hanging from the shrouds, at which I sprung with desperate energy, and earnestly did I thank the Almighty when I found myself in the rigging. As soon as I got settled, I commenced shouting for my young charge, but in vain. The confused, continuous clamour of the terrified passengers drowned my voice. When I awoke, I found him sitting by my bedside all right. About 6 o'clock they signalled the Fleetwood boat to come in, as she was passing at the time. She did so. I had no clothes, but they borrowed for me in the village trousers that came down to my knees, a waistcoat that would not button, a grey coat all torn, and a pair of boots a mile too high, and a Scotch bonnet. So with these elegant vestments you may imagine what a figure I was. I went on board the Fenella, and there found a large number of my fellow sufferers. Some had no boots, some no coats, and we were all together like a gang of gypsies. There were about 6 dead bodies on the shore when I left, and a boat came alongside the Fenella with a lady and 2 men quite dead. The lady had some seaweed on her face. The Fenella captain charged us nothing. At Troon we got into the train to Greenock. I got into the omnibus at Greenock, just missing Papa, who was at the post office, and created a great sensation in the above mentioned vehicle. One poor woman was so touched that she slipped a 4-penny piece into my hand, and was with great difficulty persuaded to take it back. When I got home I told Mama that the Orion was aground, not to alarm her, and she was so glad to see me that she never noticed my dress. But when she went into the dining room she told them, laughing, that I looked like a shipwrecked mariner. Papa soon came home and told her, and she was most awfully frightened when she heard the dangers I had escaped. Captain McNeill of Colonsay was drowned with his wife and 2 daughters. His 2 sons were saved. My name was in the paper as Mr. T and tutor, so you'll know when you see it. I hope all are well, but I am too tired of writing. I can add no further particulars. So believe me, your affectionate cousin, Duncan Darroch. What we have here is a Victorian silver and garnet brooch inscribed on reverse, presented to Duncan Darroch Esquire Younger of Gourock and Torridon by the tenantry of the estate of Gourock on the occasion of his attaining maturity, 9th of February 1889. Bonham sold this item at auction on 27th of August 2008 for £1,380. Here's a lovely view of Torridon House belonging to Duncan Darroch. Torridon can be seen as the gateway to the Torridonian Highlands and the ancient rocks of that unusually geologically twisted landscape. The red sandstone of Torridon is one of the oldest rocks in the world, having been laid down over 2,500 million years ago. In some places it is capped by a hard, white quartzite. There are records that show that Queen Victoria loved to travel the road between Torridon and Diabeg in the late 19th century. Accompanied by John Brown amongst others, she described this area as a fine and wild, uncivilized spot, like the end of the world, as she wrote in her diary, and she noted that hardly anyone ever comes here. Sadly, the area was victim to some particularly heartless clearances in these glens, especially when the estate was sold in 1831 to Colonel MacBarnett, who had made his wealth exploiting plantation workers in the West Indies. The tenant farmers were immediately cleared off to allow sheep farming, and were only left with a tiny amount of land to grow potatoes. MacBarnett ruled that no tenant could keep any sheep or cattle, and the only cow was kept at the inn. Eventually, in 1859, all the inhabitants of the area were resettled at Annet, at the head of the loch, on land taken from the already pitifully small holdings of the people there. Land that was already exhausted and liable to flooding. Meanwhile, the inhabitants of Allegan, a previously prosperous village, were ordered by MacBarnett to give up their sheep. Crofters were only allowed to keep one cow and its calf for 6 months. After that, they were deprived of a quarter of their arable land, which was given to incoming shepherds. The estate was later sold to Duncan Darroch, a wealthy man from Gourock. Fortune changed again, this time for the better. Darroch wanted a deer forest, not a sheep farm, and he saw no conflict between crofters and the presence of deer. He also believed that sheep ruined the mountain grazings for deer and cattle. So he cleared off the sheep, restored the lower grazings to the crofters, and allowed their cattle to share the hill grazings with the deer. He gave land to the previously evicted tenants at Torridon. He also fenced off the crofting land so that deer could not eat the growing crops. He allocated peat bogs for the old and new villages and gave positive encouragement, instead of forbidding, the collection of seaweed for fertiliser. He lent the tenants money for the purpose of buying cattle or for building boats. Duncan Darroch died at Torridon House in 1910. A quick note of the marriage of one of Duncan Darroch of Torridon's daughters. Miss Marion Darroch, eldest daughter of Mr. Duncan Darroch, Superior of Gourock, will be married tomorrow afternoon to the Honourable Gilbert Coleridge, son of Lord Coleridge, at the residence of Mr. Darroch in Torridon, Rossshire. Mr. Darroch has invited the tenantry on his estate to take dinner in the Ashton Hotel, Gourock, tomorrow afternoon in the honour of the event. While Duncan IV was living in Torridon, the house was leased to David Macduff Latham, accountant and bank agent, son of Grace Campbell Macduff and John Latham of the 92nd Highlanders. He was an accountant lodging at 24 Kelly Street in 1851 and married to Elizabeth Isabella Bain, daughter of Robert Bain. She died at Gourock House on the 5th of April 1892, aged 64. He died at Gourock House on the 1st of November 1906, aged 82. They had previously lived at Seafield. Latham had been involved with the Royal Bank for over 60 years, and he was last of the old bankers in Gourock, and was in his prime when Mr. Stark was in the Bank of Scotland and Mr. Thompson of Caddo Hill was head of the National Bank. He was involved with James Stewart MP in the original discussions with Palmerston over the raising of a defence force in 1859, and he was the first captain of the 1st Renfrew Rifle Volunteer Corps, progressing to major then colonel as it grew in size. While he had a certain hauteur of manner, he was approachable at all times, and he treated a dependent in the same way as he would an equal. He trained quite a number of officers who are well qualified to succeed him, and among these may be mentioned Colonel William Ross, Colonel William Leach, and Colonel William Lamont. Colonel Latham was connected with a military family, his father being a captain in a line regiment, and his uncle was the late General Macduff. He was Deputy Lieutenant and Justice of the Peace for the County of Renfrew. A member of the established church in Gourock. He was a native of Perthshire and he had 2 sons and 3 daughters. A daughter married Sir Chandos Hoskins. In the Darroch grounds at Gourock lies the mausoleum for the family. In the Memorials of Clutha, Pencilings of the Clyde in 1842, the author Elvira Ann Phipps writes of a visit. Above the glen is a wild romantic spot, thickly wooded, and in this recess is the family mausoleum. It is pleasant indeed to visit the quiet resting place of the dead, when you can do so, in sure and certain hope that the departed ones are waiting for a glorious resurrection. Hence I admire the simple tablets which this family have reared. The mausoleum is of course still in the park, and you can see from these pictures a view of the family stones inside. Over the years it has been cleared, but equally, as you can see on the left, at one point it was quite overgrown, but it has been surrounded by fencing, and I think it is open occasionally, but I could be wrong. This is one of the stones for Duncan 5. To the memory of Duncan Darroch of Gourock and Torridon, son of Major Duncan Darroch, Barrister at Law of the Inner Temple, Deputy Lieutenant for the counties of Renfrew and Ross. Born March 15, 1836, he was saved by swimming from the wreck of the SS Orion on June 18, 1850. He resided at Torridon for nearly 40 years, a well-beloved and wise proprietor, and died there, deeply lamented, on June 10, 1910. And so we can see the influence that that incident had in his life, in that it's on his memorial stone. We talked about how loved he was by the tenants or the inhabitants of Torridon, and this is a stone that was erected in memory of the devotion and affection shown by 100 men on the estate at Torridon, who at their own behest carried his body from the house on its way to interment. As an example of how family research can take you down all sorts of avenues, this is a scale working model called the Orion, built by a Richard Darroch, who was the nephew of Duncan 5. He was an engineer, railway engineer, and this is an image of him on top of the scale model of the Orion. And it's only later that they found out it was named after the ship in which his uncle had survived. The next Duncan, Duncan VI of Gourock, was Lord of the Barony and was a Major, retired 1910, of the Argyll and Southern Highlanders. He served in the First World War in Gallipoli and Sinai and died on the 23rd of May 1923. He married the daughter of Colonel George Fletcher Otley Bowie. He fought in the Bhutan expedition between 1865 and 1806 and the Second Afghan War between 1878 and 1880, gained the rank of Colonel in the service of the Royal Engineers and was vested as a Companion Order of the Star of India. So again, it fits in with the military tradition of the Darrochs. During the First World War, his wife kept up if you like, the spirits of the local people by holding fundraisers and events at Gourock House. It was also at this time that the Darroch started to separate from Gourock. To a growing town, open spaces are important, and in 1913 the Laird conveyed Darroch Park to the town council, an area of 4 3/4 acres with a few duty of 1 shilling per annum. 10 years later the council acquired from Colonel Darroch the mansion house, Gourock House, and grounds, and while the house was put to various uses, it was eventually in poor condition and was demolished. The grounds were attractively laid out and facilities provided for bowling, tennis and putting, while a bandstand was erected. This excellent green belt is a great asset to Gourock, and the garden with its high wall is one of the most delightful places in the district. So as I said, this is the time when the Darrochs moved away from Gourock. Over the next few slides we'll look at images of Gourock House and its grounds. Some of these photographs were taken by William Robertson, the local Gourock photographer. It's a view of the West Lodge. And a great picture of the interior of Darroch House, or Gourock House I should say. A typical kind of Victorian busy living room. Again, some views of the policies or the surrounding areas. The bridge, and you can see the house in the background. This is a great view of looking down Larkfield Road. You can still see this view today, obviously, with Tower Hill on your left, and probably one of the finest views in Inverclyde. Duncan became the Lieutenant Colonel of the 5th Argylls, having been called out of retirement to take command. As you can see from this recruiting advert, they emphasised his command and the idea that they couldn't get to a fight until the Argylls were fully up to number. The battalion eventually left and fought at the Battle of Akibaba, or the charge at Akibaba in Gallipoli, Turkey, on the 12th of July 1915. Here are a couple of newspaper reports that talk about the charge led by Duncan Darroch on the 12th of July. A Private John O'Hagan of the 5th Argylls, writing from His Majesty's Hospital Ship Asturias to his mother at 20 Ladybun Buildings, Greenock, explains graphically how Lieutenant Colonel Darroch of Gourock House nobly led his men on to victory. The writer states, "I now take great pleasure in writing to you, as it is the first chance I have had since I wrote on the 4th, which letter I hope you received. You will be surprised to see that I am nearing England so soon. I may tell you our boys have been in among it out here. We took part in a big bayonet charge on the 12th of July and got it pretty stiff, our lads getting a pretty bad cutting up, but thank God I escaped with a wound in my left leg. I may tell you I consider myself very lucky when I look round and see some of our poor chaps, some of them without their limbs. We expect to arrive in England on Monday. I hear they are sending all the jocks on to Scotland, and will let you know what hospital I am in as soon as I can. I don't expect to be long in hospital, as my leg is almost well with the attention I have been getting on board this ship. We're having good food, good beds and plenty of attention, so I am a very lucky man, am I not? When we came on board on the 13th of July, we got a present of a box with a pipe, tobacco, cigarettes and matches. We were supplied with cigarettes, and in fact we can have anything we ask for. I wish you'd seen our lads in that charge. We were out to take trenches, and I tell you we took them. There were the Argylls on the left and the HLI on the right. The pipers came in the charge playing, with the bullets flying round them. You should have seen Colonel Darroch from Gourock. He was out in his shirt sleeves, waving his revolver over his head and shouting, "Come on, Argylls," and we did go on. I never saw anybody run as fast as those Turks. They took to their heels. In fact, I believe some of them are running yet. Our poor lads got it pretty bad from the machine guns, but all the same, every one of them did their duty. We took the trenches we were ordered to take and one or two more. The colonel was wounded on the shoulder, and he is on board this ship. I think most of our officers were either killed or wounded. I tell you, it was a memorable 12th of July, one that won't be forgot for a long time by me. Anyway, all the time I was running, I was thinking of you all at home. I never lost my head. I think, Mother, your prayers must have been about me all the time, when I got off so lucky, as a lot of the boys were struck in the head. Never mind, it is all over now, and I am proud to say I was in that charge, so I'll soon be home again. When I was at the last dressing stage before going aboard the ship, an RAMC man asked me if I was a Roman Catholic. I said I was, so he called a chaplain out of the station. The priest heard my confession there, with the shells flying over us, so that was very nice, wasn't it? I will draw to a close as the ship is beginning to rock, hoping this finds you all at home in the best of health as it leaves me, thank God. Don't worry about my wound, Mother, as it is a mere nothing. Best love and wishes to all at home. This slide shows the view from the top of Akibaba Hill, which was the main target for the Allies. On the bottom right are views of the Highland troops, Argylls and the HLI, working at Gallipoli, and on the left is a telegraph report. On Thursday, Colonel Darroch, the brave commander of the 5th Argyll and Southern Highlanders, returned to his home at Gourock House. After being wounded at the historic charge at Akibaba on the 12th of July, he returned to Britain and was treated in a London hospital for some weeks. As he alighted from the train, it was evident he is still in the convalescent stage. Few, if any, outside the family circle knew that the colonel was returning to Gourock that day. Still, a good many recognised him as he walked along to his motor car which awaited him. Colonel Darroch and the men under him performed deeds which ring all along the Clyde, and it is the sincere wish of all that he will soon be completely restored to health. So while at home recuperating, Lieutenant Colonel Duncan Darroch continued with the work locally, and this report is about the opening of a new rifle range at Gourock. Unfortunately, the effects of his wound were such that he died as a consequence some 8 years after being wounded at Gallipoli, dying on the 22nd of May 1923. These are the funeral flowers that were placed in the family mausoleum. Duncan Darroch, the 7th of Gourock, of Colden, Portlawnteith, Perthshire, Lord of the Barony of Gourock, Captain and Major in the Argyll and Southern Highlanders, served in the First World War and in the Second World War, mentioned in dispatches. He was educated at Harrow, and he married in 1926 Rose Mary Helena Lillian at Swanston Cottage, Edinburgh, the daughter of Captain Alan Kenrick Henderson, late of the 16th Lancers. He would die on the 27th of December 1960. So once again, a Duncan Darroch continuing the long tradition of military service. This is him on the left in 1926, on the right as a young officer, and in the middle later in life when he was at Gourock for the Highland Games. This is just some paperwork that was found, and it's just describing the farms that were owned or run by the Gourock barony or by the Darrochs. So they were up for sale. As I said, the family had moved away and they were now living in Edinburgh and were now moving throughout the world, as families do, living in England and beyond. There's a picture of him and his father. And this is a picture of him at the Gourock Highland Games. This is Swanston Cottage in Edinburgh. Apparently Robert Louis Stevenson stayed there for a while, but this is where the Darrochs lived. This is the order of service for the memorial service for Duncan Darroch 7, done or read by W.E. Caskey in Old Gourock Church, 1961. Gourock House was used for several purposes once it was acquired by the Gourock Council. It was a tea room at one point, and also during the war it was used as a base for the ARP. This is a lovely image of the wardens, the Gourock wardens that were based at Gourock House during the war. And so we come to Duncan Darroch VIII, who was born in 1931, and he was the son of Duncan Darroch VII of Gourock and Rosemary Henderson. He married Nicola Jean Seidel, a daughter of Robert George Seidel, on the 24th of March 1956 and died on the 1st of February 2011, aged 79. Again, educated at the Royal Military Academy, Sandhurst, and prior to that at Harrow. He gained the rank of captain in 1957 in the Argyll Southern Highlanders and held the position of Chief of the Name and Arms of Darroch from December 27th, 1960, living in Camberley in Surrey. This is a needlework version done by one of the Darroch family of Gourock House. And this is Duncan Darroch being presented with the colours of the 1st Battalion of the Argyll Southern Highlanders by the Queen. And you can see this is the tradition of the Darrochs having been involved in the military, and especially the Argyll and Sutherlands, for almost 200 years. And so we come to the current Laird, who is Claire, the Lady of the Barony, Claire Darroch Thompson. The family of the Darrochs have little link to Gourock now, the generations having moved to other areas of the UK, but in recent years Claire Darroch has been invited to be chieftain of the Gourock Highland Games. She was also invited to represent the family at the centenary of the Gallipoli charge at Akibaba. An exhibition was held at the Maclean Museum, and every year a flower is put on the memorial at Finnart Street, where the 5th Argylls had their headquarters. So still the tradition of the Darrochs and their connection with Gourock lives on through the Fithergiles. I'll finish with a story that came to light recently on the internet, and it takes us back to the beginning of the Darroch family story and refers to the strong military connections that we have seen. For years, Auckland lawyers Gareth Bodle and Jennifer George and their son Darroch were the custodians of a trove of artefacts that were taken from Bago's Shuwemauda Pagoda, the tallest pagoda in Myanmar, when the city was sacked by British troops in 1852. The trove included a large marble Buddha statue, a small silver Buddha statue, a brass vase, a candle holder shaped like a serpent, a gong and striker, a little bell, an ivory seal, and 3 tiny ivory figurines. On the 17th of November 1852, there was an assault on Bago, and that was the one that Captain Donald Darroch took part in, and upon taking the pagoda they took their souvenirs. Gareth recounted at the handover ceremony, referencing his great-great-grandfather's military record, that great-great-grandfather would later go on to participate in the storming of Rangoon. This is Donald Darroch on the left, and these are the objects that were handed down through the family. And so, recently, the family decided to return these objects. And these are the Darroch descendants who handed back these objects to Myanmar or Burma. Okay, I think we'll end there. As I say, a very interesting story about the Darrochs and their connections with the Gourock and their military connections throughout the 200 years, but all based on the success or the money made by Duncan I as he came back from the West Indies. I hope you enjoyed. Thank you for listening. See you again soon.